Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, this is Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter solicitors. I am the solicitor leading our team on the COVID inquiry, and this is our fourth podcast on Module 2. And as always, I am joined by one of our clients, Lorelei King, as co-host. We have three people joining us on the panel today. First is Anthony Metzer, KC, who acts for three long COVID groups. Nathan Oswin, who is the lead on the inquiry work on behalf of the TUC. And we are also joined by Amos Waldman, who is another of our clients and is joining us today to give his perspective on the evidence heard this week.
Thanks, Nicola. What a week. I mean, it's been crazy. As a bereaved person and having spoken to many other bereaved people in our group, this testimony has been just unbearably difficult to listen to. And I think part of it is because I knew it was bad. I knew this government, not only the preparation that we heard in Module 1, but what they actually did. I knew it was bad, but it is so much worse than I'd even imagined. This breathtaking level of incompetence and learning the things the former prime minister and his advisors were saying about being happy to sacrifice the old people. And a lot of this was when my husband died early in the pandemic. And as I've said before, it's just like seeing how I don't think he had to die. They didn't have to take the school holidays off, for example. And it's just been unbearably painful. And there was so much testimony from so many people. On the first day, Anthony, I think on behalf of your clients, you talked to Imran Shaffi and Lee Kane, who were both there the first day. What did you make of their testimony?
Yes, well, thank you, Lorelei, and absolutely. I'm sure this was in many ways a devastating week for you and all bereaved, and also, frankly, for our clients, from our clients' point of view, in terms of the long COVID. Before I talk about the specific witnesses I asked questions of, I think it's really become very apparent that there was a full recognition by the summer of 2020. June, July time, where the government and all the various departments clearly knew a significant amount about long COVID, and long COVID was simply not considered when on the question of the NPIs, and there's quite clearly a huge reluctance to recognise the significance of long COVID, a huge failure in terms of messaging, both first in relation to in letting people know that they're suffering from long COVID, because obviously one of the most shocking aspects for my clients was the fact that they were thankfully not dying, but also not recovering and being utterly bewildered and confused as to what was going on. There was clearly, and I think we will find the evidence will increasingly show this, a complete failure to give proper messaging, both of the symptoms of long COVID, so that people could understand they were suffering from the huge implications in terms of doctors not accepting or believing that their patients were coming to them with long COVID and not being acknowledged and accepted, and also a failure to give proper messaging, communication, that those who contracted or had COVID were at risk of developing long COVID. And these two huge messages were very important. And clearly, government and the relevant departments knew about that. And for reasons which may well tie in very closely to the character and the personality of the then Prime Minister, there was a complete failure to take long COVID into account in so many significant ways. So I think that's a really clearly establishing feature of the evidence that we've seen so far. In terms of the two witnesses that you've mentioned, Imran Shaffi, he followed Martin Reynolds, who, of course, I didn't ask questions for, but you will remember, I'm sure, how he gave his evidence. I mean, it was I hope I'm not being too unfair to say he was utterly hopeless as a witness. And you can just imagine he'd be in many, many ways the sort of person that Boris Johnson would thought was ideal, who would never question, would never say boo to a goose. And it was a remarkable feature, of course, that he, of course, famously dealt with one of the parties. I think he was the one who suggested bring a bottle to the party. I hope I'm not being too cheap to say this, but the way he gave his evidence, it seemed to belie the sort of party-ish impression that he might give. And I'm not sure that I'd have particularly enjoyed having an evening chatty with Martin Reynolds at the party. But that's perhaps a little cheap point. The more serious point, really, about Martin Reynolds is that this is that type of a person in a significant position in terms of his closeness with Boris Johnson, and one can recognise readily how nothing would be challenged by him. He would simply really seem to have no opinions. So after that, Imran Shaffi, who I think emerges well, actually, and both in terms of the quality of the way he gave his evidence. He was also, like most of the witnesses, I think, very careful to try and protect his back and those immediately around him. But he comes across, I think, he came across pretty well and relatively caring and concerned. And of course, we know that Imran Shaffi was somebody who tried to, in terms of long COVID, he tried very hard to get a message through to Boris Johnson about the concerns he had about long COVID, using initially Chris Whitty. I think probably my assessment of Imran Shaffi was that he was a good witness, and certainly he relatively junior, but clearly intelligent. Was very much thinking and looking in the right direction, asking the right questions and expressing the appropriate concern. Because he was relatively junior, of course, understandably, he would probably not have had the influence otherwise. But he does seem to be somebody that across the board, people thought highly of. And of course, that he seems to have been one of the few people who impressed Dominic Cummings, which was quite a high threshold to achieve. That in itself, maybe not hugely significant, but I would say probably my assessment of Shaffi, in terms of where he answered the questions that I asked, and more generally, I formed a pretty good impression about Shaffi.
He gave what I thought was a really interesting insight into the character of the former prime minister. When, in fact, was it on the subject of long COVID when they wanted to give him a note about it, and rather than do it in writing, he said we had to do it as a verbal discussion, because sometimes if it's something they don't want to hear, verbal is better than written. And I thought that was an interesting insight into the character of the man.
It was in the context, because it was his conversation that Shaffi had, and it did come from questions that I asked. His conversation with Chris Whitty about the best way to approach with Johnson the issue of long COVID, and Whitty's answer, which Shaffi seemed to agree with, was better done verbally than in any other way. There's a big question, which we will find with Whitty, is whether, in fact, he had the courage to actually speak to Johnson about it, knowing his, if we use the word most neutral, his scepticism about long COVID. Clearly, it was worse than that. Of course, famously, importantly, in October, he is scrawling in capitals over the document in relation to long COVID, which is an extraordinary feature of the case, which is has attracted considerable interest already. So we'll await to see what Whitty will say about whether, in fact, he said something, or it was just too difficult, too awkward, and he failed to do so, in which case Johnson will maintain that he was not fully briefed about long COVID until many months later.
That one little tidbit you just mentioned about scrawling and saying it was Gulf War syndrome and all that. I've spoken to quite a few of your clients actually at the hearing or whatever, or online, and that was so devastating to hear for people with long COVID. It was just awful. That's just a little sidebar there, but
it's terrible. Huge, because I think they always feared, as you know, that they have felt very much disbelieved, not recognised, not acknowledged, and to hear that the Prime Minister, his attitudes towards these many people suffering, that he was basically implying that they were making it up, or that there wasn't a real medical condition, and so dismissive. I mean, it wasn't even skepticism, really. I mean, skepticism is a generous word. That is total dismissal.
And what did you make of Lee Kane? And maybe we can all talk more about Lee Kane too. What did you make of him compared to Shaffi?
Well, I think Lee Kane, obviously, his communications is his thing, and he's pretty good at self-protection. I was very pleased that we got an apology out of him, which is probably a rare thing. I think we regard it as a little victory to get an apology from him. I would say Kane, he was, to us, I think, we made progress with him. We got some acknowledgements. We got some recognition. He didn't go as far as we would like him to have gone, but I think there was a sort of a recognition of significant awareness of long COVID from a relatively early stage. And although he was very self-protective, and of course we know very close to Cummings, he was, I think, more open and. Still, my personal view is that he's still a very difficult witness and a complicated character. But I think evidentially we didn't do badly out of him.
I was very glad you tackled him about the inconsistent messaging as well, because just that is a theme for this government, not just with long COVID, with everything else, is a consistent theme. Inconsistent messaging.
Thank you.
I wonder if we could circle back a minute to Party Marty, because one thing that I just found so upsetting was when he was called out on when the parties were discovered, and he was asked if he thought that helped to destroy confidence. And I found his answer extraordinary. He was unbelievably weaselly about it. Like, he gave this kind of sad apology, but didn't think there was any harm in it until Hugo Keith corrected him and said the news actually broke in 2021. We were still in the pandemic. I just found that shocking. What did anyone else think about it? Nicola, what did you think about him?
Yeah, his whole evidence session was incredibly difficult to bear. He really struggled to answer a single question in a normal way. He did everything he could to weasel out of giving a straight answer. But to that question in particular, his answer was, he's deeply sorry for his part in those events. He apologizes unreservedly for the message it sends. But because the story didn't break until 15 months later, he didn't think the damage it did was that significant. And that is just astounding, because 15 months later, people were still being asked to follow. Okay, we weren't in the strictest of rules then, but we were still being asked to follow rules, change our behaviour, and look to this government with trust, respect, and confidence. And he thinks that wasn't damaged. Unbelievable.
Also, what he thinks is, and this is I've just thought of this, so it's getting me mad. Those of us who lost people and couldn't be with them when he was partying, our loved ones are still dead. And hearing the news 15 months later doesn't make, it makes it worse. It just rips that scab off each time. I mean, I thought it was horrific. Nathan, what did you make of him as a witness?
Well, I think it shows how flippant the government has been treating everything, and some of the key actors still are, that actually this sense of, it only came out at the end of 2021, and an apology that felt more like, I'm sorry we got caught, rather than I'm genuinely sorry for the actions, prefaced by that release of that sort of extraordinary WhatsApp that we'd all heard about before, we've got to do a party for such and such. And I think it's Lee Kane that says, no, that's a terrible idea. This is against the rules. And this sort of really disappointed response that you get from Martin Reynolds, and sort of, oh, what? Nothing. And again, these are the people that were writing the laws. And when you combine that with I'm sure we'll come on to it later, but Helen McNamara talking about how they were laughing at the Italians as that was happening through this, bizarre Hancock's pretending to play cricket at the cabinet office door, all these bizarre stories that just gives you a sense that there was a real flippancy about what was happening in crisis. And as Anthony was saying about his clients with long COVID, you know, for the people we represent at the TUC and the nurses and care workers and teachers and transport workers and factory workers who are literally going in day after day, exposing themselves to the virus and treating the situation with anything but flippancy, it's just a kick in the teeth again. It's the lack of any form of care or compassion or ability to empathise with what was a terrified population at a time of great national crisis.
As a fellow bereaved, I'm sure you found that tough hearing him.
Yeah, incredibly tough. And as you know, as Nathan was saying, it sort of permeated all of them really. And I think that surprised me in a way, that I kind of had the image of, you know, Boris Johnson you'd accept, or, you know, Rishi Sunak. You could see these characters who you imagined acting in this way. But even Helen McNamara, who in many respects was an impressive witness, she still went to a party, didn't she? And she provided a DJ machine or a jukebox or something for the party, and still tried to say that, you know, this is, probably moving too far ahead here, but, you know, talking about how they were stressed and she was worried about how people were, you know, when we think about what we were doing at the time, trying to attending Zoom funerals, not being able to meet up as a family to grieve properly. You know, to hear that was really, really traumatic. So yeah, I found that really, really tough.
I think I absolutely agree with what Amos is saying, that in many, many ways she was a very impressive witness. And I thought she did remarkably in dealing with the horrific misogyny that Cummings exposed her to. And she was very, very impressive the way that she didn't rise to the bait and kept speaking in return respectfully. But I think Amos makes a point. The primary position of all the witnesses, I think, across the board, even Helen McNamara, and as I say, in many ways I was impressed with her as a witness, is self-protect first. And secondly, and this is not true of all the witnesses, but self-protect first. And if you're going to blame, shift blame, put the blame anywhere else. And I think the slight feeling I'm getting is that they think if everybody collectively can shift the blame somewhere else, it's very hard to get to the truth, because it's a constantly moving goal about who was more implicated, who was more responsible, who failed worse. And I'm not suggesting this was orchestrated, but it is very, very difficult the way it feels like sort of a plasticine experience of every time you press somewhere and you have a correct and justified attack on someone, or criticism of someone else is there to be blamed. And the real underlying problem beyond that, and it's going to be something that the chair is going to have to deal with, is that there's this. I mean, Helen McNamara actually does do this in fairness, but essentially the witnesses just so lack emotional literacy, and there's no fundamental recognition of the huge and absolutely irreparable harm that has been caused to the bereaved primarily, but just, and I will stress this point for my clients, and also the ongoing suffering of my clients long COVID and all the other clients whose interests are represented. And as has been said, for example, the TUC members, and across the board, what is not at the centre of any of their thinking, save to some extent with Helen McNamara, is a primary recognition of the devastating harm that they collectively have done, as well as individually.
Shall we talk about Cummings? That was quite the day, or quite the testimony. Who wants to kick off?
Yeah, it was quite a day. And I think it's turned up the best quote to illustrate what all the evidence is showing during Module 2. And in a rare example of a broken clock being right twice a day, it's from Boris Johnson, when one of the WhatsApps was revealed that it said a disgusting orgy of narcissism by a government that should be solving a national crisis. And for me, that whole line has just summed up so much of what was clearly happening in Downing Street and the government at the time. Cummings himself I think he so failed to take the opportunity to do what was A, would have been right and proper, but B, would have reinforced his evidence when, as Anthony said, he just couldn't bring himself to say sorry or even accept the hurt that the Barnard Castle trip had done to people. And of course, primarily that hurt is felt more acutely by those who suffered a loss and by people with those long-term impacts. But I think that was a great insult to everyone in the country who was obeying the rules at the time and doing their best and taking the complete opposite approach of a disgusting orgy of narcissism in regards to the pandemic.
Nathan, what you just said about Barnard Castle, for me particularly, that was the 27th. That was when my husband was ill. That was exactly when I couldn't be with him, and he died 4 days later. So for me, this man is more odious than almost anyone else. And to hear him defend himself again about that trip was horrible. That's all I wanted to say.
I think it's that element as well that it reinforces what Anthony was saying, that there's just a thing going on here with so many of the witnesses that is about a preservation of legacy or self-interest or a defense of their actions, rather than an acceptance of some very clear, very knowing facts that the rest of us all sort of accept. It's just undeniable that his trip caused offence to millions of people across. He couldn't even bring himself to say that. I worry that some of the important information he did bring to bear, some of that was very important to me, was very informative, is potentially undermined by his failure to take steps like that. And then, of course, the sort of crude language, which was, I think that the thing I've read most on it that I think sums up that whole day was, if evidence was foul-mouthed, it was morally fouler, a repugnant morass of nastiness, arrogance, contempt, misogyny, backstabbing, and venal self-interest set against the torn backdrop of an austerity-ravaged state, which was in today's Mirror in Oswin Jones' article. And that day summed that up for me.
Yeah.
Anthony, I'm sorry. I think I interrupted you. You were about to say something.
No, not at all. I really wanted to say, I think what you, Lorelei, and Nathan have said is so true. This was an opportunity. On reflection, he's no longer close to the government. He has no access. He has no sense he has to be responsible. In fact, he certainly pulled no punches in tearing in and attacking the reputation, as he had done in the WhatsApps and the emails at the time, for many members of the government, some in most graphic terms. And I want to say something in a moment about Helen McNamara, in a moment about what you said about her. But this was an opportunity, on reflection, to have some empathy for what he did. And he still could have been careful. Personally, I think he should have made a full apology, made an apology at the time. That's my personal view. But irrespective of that, if he wasn't going to apologize, at least enter the language of seeing from how it's looked for you, someone like you, Lorelei, with your husband being ill at the time. He even implied that it really was almost no big deal, frankly. Not only was he wrongly persecuted, as he saw it, by the media, but this was a trivial and tiny event. And that is a form, a bit like my clients have felt about their attitude towards long COVID, that is a form of almost gaslighting. It is basically belittling, dismissing and trivializing the feelings, the hurt, the upset of many tens of thousands, and that was really inexcusable. I think and I think Nathan said this a bit. Some of his evidence, because it is a bit like. It had an impression of the biblical Samson. If he was going to come down, he's going to bring everyone down with him. And some of his evidence, I think, was very, very powerful in relation to criticisms of others, the incredible ineptitude, the refusal when he and Valence realised in the middle of March that the policies that had previously existed were not going to work in terms of herd immunity, and the resistance and the reluctance to change course to come to, as a necessarily by then, to a lockdown and how slow it took the process. Some of that evidence was actually probably true. I mean, who knows? But I think they had a feeling that some of the evidence that when he was critical of others, it had the feeling of truth about it. But the difficulty is, and it will be for the chair, of course, that when you're looking at how he dealt with Barnard Castle, which was contemptuous and appalling, and the language that was used, okay, he did apologize when he did, in fact, he apologized a second time right at the end, but the damage was done. And so therefore, one wonders how he's going to be regarded in terms of credibility. It's clear that the two observations that arise from that. First of all, Hugo Keith, who obviously did a very long cross-examination of Cummings, did the effectively, I think, although some would say that as I think there's been a feeling, very strong feeling from our clients, and I think across the board, core participants, there's been over-focus on the first lockdown as opposed to the second and third lockdowns. Many things were more seriously wrong in relation to the second wave and the what happened from the summer of 2020. So there has been, I think, a feeling so far of over preoccupation with the first lockdown. But that said, Keith did, I think, very effectively took the bits of Cummings' evidence where he was attacking of others very well, used him to cooperate to get those good, helpful bits of evidence where it was critical of other government departments or politicians, and then turned on him later, not just with Barnard Castle, but also in relation to his primarily, obviously, and very principally, the misogyny. I want to just have, as I say, I wanted a word about that. And I thought that devastating last question, when he finally, Cummings is finally, Johnson sacks him finally in I think the 13th of November, and the last time he's in office, there's an email exchange, I think 2 days later, the 15th, and he says to him, this I thought devastating last question, so you never returned to office after that 15th of November, and you left the country to be in the charge of somebody that you knew was simply not fit for office. Answer yes. It was an extraordinary, powerful conclusion to the questions that Keith asked of him. And the other thing I just want to say about the misogyny, it was horrific. And there's no other way to describe it. It was absolutely. And I think Cummings may well, who knows, has. I think his personality, his character is complicated. But when he said, "I'm not a misogynist because the language I use is worse towards male colleagues than it is towards Helen McNamara and other female colleagues," that to me just showed he doesn't have the beginnings of understanding what misogyny is about. That he doesn't seem to understand the issues about power and balance. He doesn't understand that in terms of the way you speak to women has to, as a man, has to be different to how you speak to men, and you can't get away with the sort of what they would regard as sort of rough joshing between male colleagues, very, very public schooly, very privileged type language. You cannot speak like that. And when he says you have to compare how I am to a man, that to me just showed he didn't have the beginnings of understanding what misogyny really means.
I agree, especially then also he sort of gave this précis about how many women he'd hired using the old "some of my best friends are" kind of argument. Nicola, what did you make of any aspect of his testimony you'd care to talk about?
I think what is quite telling is if this inquiry relied on the statements of people who are still in office, we would have nowhere near the truth. Statements from people who have left office often carry that element of, well, they've got an axe to grind, so obviously they would say that. But to get access to the WhatsApps, the emails, the Patrick Vallance diaries that were written at the time where no one has any reason to put things in writing other than their true feelings. That's the beauty of the Dominic Cummings WhatsApps. As painful as it has been for everyone to hear, we are getting to the nub of the truth, at least of how he felt and the kinds of communications he was sharing with other people in power at that time. And him and his colleague Lee Kane, something else that Lee Kane said that was absolutely striking, which was, I don't think we had the right crisis for the skills of this Prime Minister. No, we didn't have the right Prime Minister for this crisis that we had to face.
Amos, what was your standout from Dominic Cummings' testimony?
I think it's hard not to be furious just generally. Just him approaching the witness box and giving evidence is pretty traumatic, because what it reminds me of is, the time when he did that ridiculous Rose Garden speech, and we waited for half an hour for him to come. And when he came and sat there and just lied and lied and lied, and it was laughable, it was literally laughable. And then after that, we had Conservative MPs who were supporting him. Matt Hancock, I think, defended him, didn't he, initially? And they were all coming out to defend him. And, when I think of what we were going through at the time, and they did ask him about this in his evidence, and said, look, it damaged public confidence, didn't it? And there've been comprehensive, I think there was a Lancet article that looked at it, and he was saying, well, you can't really look at my behaviour in isolation, because there were other things that were going on, such as the government's actions and things that were changing. Well, no, actually, if the Lancet report looked at all the confounders, looked at these variables and discounted them, and looked at things like the Google searches that were done about Dominic Cummings at that time, and public trust plummeted. And that was the start when the public trust plummeted, because obviously then we had the parties, and at each stage, incrementally, it got worse, didn't it? And people weren't complying. And that, for when we'd been through and lost people in my grandma, on the 2nd of April, to see that happening, and then people going through the same unnecessarily because public trust had been undermined. And, it's the same with Boris Johnson. When the things about the Partygate came out, he then started removing restrictions, almost to put some distance between what had happened and the pandemic, and say, well, no one will mind because it's not important anymore. And that's what it felt like. And it felt like, he was there again, giving evidence, just insulting us, really, insulting all our intelligence, and also trying to make out that, he was such a big brain and was brilliant and instrumental in getting a lockdown eventually. But this goes for so many people, whether it's even, members of SAGE or members of the government. No one actually said anything at the time, did they? They didn't come out, and you had Whitty and Balance. I'm sure they're great people, and I know they're respected, but they stood next to him at the press conferences. They stood next to Boris Johnson at these press conferences. And, I don't think they did enough, really, unfortunately. But, going back to Dominic Cummings and his, Lee Cain as well. Lee Cain gave a bit of an insight into what was going on. Although, again, he was another witness who didn't really, in some respects, wouldn't criticise Boris Johnson. He was excusing his going away on holiday at the beginning. And he was saying, well, I don't really think that made much of a difference. And when he was asked about the 10-day delay between the 14th of March and them realising that, a lockdown was essential and unavoidable, that nothing happened for 10 days. And again, he excused that. But he did, Lee Cain gave quite an insight into what was going on. It was what we knew. But again, the lack of diversity in terms of gender, in terms of people from walks of life, when he was talking about Marcus Rashford's campaign, and none of them understood it. They just couldn't get their heads around it because they lived in their ivory towers and it didn't affect them. So this was the same, and this happened, but as inequalities shone through, people with disabilities who were well hit, they just didn't get it. They didn't understand it at all, did they? It was just shocking, really, the level. And when you think of, I remember seeing the contrast between Boris Johnson early on and a video, I saw this again the other day, but it was a video contrasting Jacinda Ardern and Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson, and it was a montage of people like, I think even Patrick Balance were involved, saying we're going to take it on the chin, and Boris Johnson on Good Morning TV saying we're going to take it on the chin. And then you had Jacinda Ardern just saying, I just couldn't tolerate the number of deaths it would take to get to herd immunity, when herd immunity, as we know, isn't possible anyway. It just wasn't going to happen, and especially not without a vaccine. So, again, looking through Helen McNamara and the way things were set up, these were such a limited pool of people, weren't they, making these decisions, affecting us all. And it just happened. And I think diversity across the civil service as well, obviously, and also SAGE. Anthony Costello who I know gave evidence fairly recently, but he was talking about the lack of any independent public health expertise on Sage, so that when they were sort of saying, oh, we can't do anything, we haven't got enough testing, he and other experts were screaming out saying, no, you need to follow the WHO advice and test, trace and isolate. You need to do this. And because they didn't listen to any, they got into this groupthink situation where even the experts initially were, not recommending suppression, but they're probably, again, a bit of a side issue. But
I do agree with you, Amos. I think the things that we learned, for me, just again, not just with Cummings, but just learning how reviled and disrespected Matt Hancock was, who had responsibility for the most vulnerable people in our country. I just found that horrifying. And yet none of them, he stayed in position. The prime minister didn't remove him. No one did. Nicola, that kind of goes back to what you were saying about it not being the right set of circumstances for that prime minister. I just found that horrifying. Helen McNamara, some people have touched on that.
I mentioned her already before. Can I just echo something that I think really that Amos said, which is it is a hugely significant feature that in self-protecting, as these witnesses try to do, how it cries out that no one spoke out, resigned, or did anything to show dissociation or dissatisfaction with something where we can see internally it was chaos, it was mayhem, it was a complete failure to make responsible decisions on a carefully calibrated way. And that's leaving aside the big trolleying question that Cummings talked about. He's a classic example himself. If he was so appalled by what was going on, why did he never speak out? Why did he not resign? In the end, he's kicked out by Johnson because of the debacle coming out of Barnard Council. He doesn't even resign in November. So that's a really good example of that. And your point, which I think we're going to know a lot more in relation to Hancock, but if Cummings is right about this and those around him suggest he was Helen McNamara included, that he was lying about a plan and lying in other regards, that is an appalling thing for a minister in a very serious, important role, particularly in a pandemic, but a very high role in any event in government. That a minister of such seniority who is at least appearing to say, and may well be established, lying, that no one speaks out. It just carries on, as an internal sort of character assassination, probably both ways, but nothing comes to the public, and we know nothing about this until this inquiry reveals it. So specifically coming on to Helen McNamara, I was overall very impressed with her as a witness. I think she was obviously in a very senior position in really toxic, working in an extremely toxic way. She was dignified. When the way she gave her evidence, she didn't resort to the level of vitriol that we'd seen earlier from particularly from Cummings, but in a more restrained way from other witnesses too. And I think she was doing a very difficult job, pretty well, in fact, well. And I think overall, I was extremely impressed with her as a witness. And my instincts tell me that she will, when the chair comes to assessing her evidence, will regard her as a witness essentially of truth.
And Nicola, what did our team make of her?
It's difficult to strike that balance between considering the careful, considered evidence she gave, whilst knowing she did attend a party and took a karaoke machine along, and she justified that on the basis of her team were at breaking point, whilst there were people sitting in the same room as her, watching her give evidence, who had been taken to that same very breaking point, but didn't break the rules. Notwithstanding that difficulty in those two issues with her evidence was powerful for a number of reasons. Obviously, there's this reference to the overconfidence that was displayed throughout the cabinet that she found incredibly jarring. And that was present in a number of individuals, but certainly in Matt Hancock, in her view. And that when he reassured the Cabinet Office time and time again, she said, that he had seen the plans, they were being reviewed, they were ready, they were good to go. To find out that there were none was just completely bewildering. She then refers to him taking this Batman stance, saying he loved the responsibility and they bowl them at me and I knock them back every time. Just completely devoid of any humility, and or even just saying thank you for recognizing the scale of the task I have to do, Helen. No one else has done that. And then she talks about the lack of women who, prior to COVID, there were plenty of women working in Whitehall, but once COVID hit, it was only the most senior people present. And all of a sudden, the women disappeared. It was all white men sitting around the table. And that meant that there were gaps in policy. And this cost women their lives because there was no one there to say, our PPE doesn't fit. I need my partner present while I give birth. You're sending me home to my abuser who I can't escape. My children are in a care home and are vulnerable. There was no one there to say that. And she tried and tried and tried. And it was too late for many women, unfortunately.
And it looks like all she got for that was abuse. I wasn't able to hear much of Thursday's testimony. I heard a little bit of Simon Stevens' testimony. He's a former CEO of NHS England. And of course, in the news, it's a lot today and yesterday about, or recently, about how Hancock thought that he should decide who would live or die if the NHS were overwhelmed. Amos, what did you think of him as a witness and what he said?
I didn't think he was an oppressive witness at all. I mean, I honestly thought that if he was paying back his peerage, is I think what I put in an email to Nicola the other day, because none of what he said made sense at all. I mean, it was frankly insulting what he was saying about the NHS avoiding we were never in that position of the NHS being overwhelmed when, healthcare, we all saw that. Everyone, well, most people saw that and knew that. So that was just, for anyone that was a frontline worker hearing that must have been just horrendous. But also what he was saying, this was another theme that a few of them were saying. Again, there's this issue of them denying when they were aware of aerosol and asymptomatic transmission. And this is, no one wants to admit that they were, but we've had several witnesses who said that pretty early on. And we know from the High Court ruling on care homes that they were aware and failed to take into account asymptomatic spread. So those were insulting. But then on care homes, he was saying things like there weren't any new care home admissions. It was all people who were in care homes who went to hospital and were discharged to care homes again, which is just ridiculous because, we all know that people have injuries in wherever they are at home or they can't cope at home anymore. And then they're admitted to hospital and then discharged to a care home. So that wasn't true. He was also saying that he was talking about in terms of discharges, there was a report that he referred to in his statement from Public Health England about their hospital discharges only contributing minimally to the spread of the disease. And I remember this report came out in late 2020, I think it was about May 2021. And it came out at a time when Hancock was being criticised about care homes, I think by Cummings, actually, if I remember correctly. But they'd sat on this. It was a report that they said related to the early part of 2020 when there were hospital discharges. But the report itself said it needed to be revised because it didn't have the up-to-date figures on it. And also they'd sat on it for this time. But I think because it was so bad. And I remember, the criticism of it at the time was it was based on testing. And of course, there was no testing at this early stage. So it was completely ineffective. And then the things like the criteria for a hospital-acquired infection were so limited that if you'd been at hospital for 2 days in the preceding 14 days from the positive test, even if you contracted in hospital, that wasn't counted as a hospital case of COVID. So, and again, they had no testing in the care homes. And even on the face of the report, there were still hundreds of people that they showed, according to this report, died directly as a result of hospital discharges. So the fact that they were prepared to, rely on, and it was always going to come up because they tried it before. They produced this report at a press conference. It was Jenny Harries, who I won't go into at this point in time, but, she was saying things like, children won't get it. They're more likely to get run over by a bus. Face masks don't work, and large gatherings are fine. So, it just had no credibility. And I just think that his evidence really didn't have much credibility. And I think, was it him who was asked about Matt Hancock's credibility as well and honesty? And he was basically saying, well, I don't have the evidence to say. I've been brought up to think the best of people, which was just, again, it just wasn't credible at all.
I just think there's something, isn't there? I mean, first, I think between Simon Stevens sort of doing the NHS wasn't overwhelmed, and Helen McNamara's experiences and horrificness that she had to put up with have proved the very reason why trade unions are needed and still relevant in 2023. That workforces are just terribly ignored with those bits. I mean, the Stevens element, as you'll probably know, the TUC submitted a second witness statement into Module 2, which is now publicly available, which is just the lived experience stories of 40 plus workers across the country. Many of those are workers within the NHS. And if you go and read them, there's no way you'll come away thinking that there was no point that the NHS wasn't overrun. It was, this is a system that is on red alert pretty much every winter for the last 6 years, let alone since 2016, let alone during a public health crisis. And I think part of this goes back to what Amos was saying earlier, that there's a weird thing that's happened this week, which is actually some of the witnesses who have come across quite well are coming across quite well because of how badly the other witnesses are. But actually the whole system and everyone has been a bit tainted by the things that have been said and the mistakes and inactions that have been made. And that was one of my constant thoughts during McNamara's testimony, was that it felt more honest and open and an attempt to engage. But I'm afraid to say, that I don't think any of the people we've sort of spoken to this week are the heroes that sort of tried to make everything better. There are moments of flashing bits, and actually I thought Halpin's evidence was quite informative on the late Thursday, and him talking about self-isolation and why that was important, similar to Cummings on the Tuesday. I just get worried that some of that's going to get lost in the mix if we're not careful, because so much of the system was clearly breaking down. I think this has been, for people who sort of believe in the system, should be that thing that we can have faith in, and that rally around the flag factor that so many had in the early days of the pandemic, for lack of a better term. It's a real testing shake of faith when actually you do find people like the person who was running the NHS during that time, or, all of the people in number 10, leave you with a real worry about their credibility and ability of the system to handle things. And the way I've been saying to some colleagues this week is, all those thoughts in the back of your head that people had at various points during the pandemic when you thought, no, it can't be that bad. People can't get to run a country like the United Kingdom and be that bad at that point. And that sort of rational mind sort of sets it aside. It's even worse than some of that part. And that's what's been coming out that week. And I do worry slightly about what will it do to our faith in a system that's already been shaken so much across the last decade or more.
I agree with you 100%, Nathan. I think that's such a good point. And as I said, it is so much worse than I thought it was. Anthony, what did you make of Thursday's witnesses?
I think the way that Nathan was summarised by other witnesses, Amos, Nathan, in relation to Stevens, I would agree with. I think it was in his case, he tried quite slickly to basically not answer questions, not take responsibility, try and do his best to evade anything getting home. I would share the view that he was actually not a credible witness. And for someone as senior as he was, I expected him to be a little more, again, I was disappointed to see that he was not prepared to take more responsibility for his where his responsibility lay. Again, sought to minimise, sought to not answer questions directly, as most of the witnesses this week. And I do think, okay, he was in a different position because he was not part of the government. But I think Halpern was a good example of someone whose evidence really did sound credible and accurate. Obviously, his position was different; he didn't have to protect himself in the same way. But I was not surprised, but I was disappointed by Stevens. And then it was compounded by Wormald. I mean, words defy talking about Wormald. I mean, as you know, personally, got frustrated because we didn't have many questions for him, and we were stopped from asking the questions that I think we should have been entitled to ask, because we'd been given permission to ask these questions. And I don't want to take this opportunity to be too gripey at this moment, but there was a lot of frustration from our part. But what was absolutely apparent was the reason we weren't really able to answer the questions is because he would just filibuster. He just wouldn't answer a question. And he kept saying, I'll come back to you. And we knew that this was an attempt to avoid answering the questions, to, if requested, he would get advice as to how best to answer the question more fully in relation to communications and issues that we raised with him, lack of communication about long COVID. And it was classic. It was embarrassing in one sense, and very frustrating to see the extent to which he was permitted and really to not answer a question. And in any other environment, except the limited number of minutes that we were given, which we were cut across to cross-examine, to ask questions. In any other court, we would have trapped him in terms of his inability to deliberate refusal to answer questions. I have to say, it wasn't just our experience with Wormald. You could see how the counsel to the inquiry found him just as frustrated. This is a man who produced many voluminous statements running to hundreds of pages, who definitely thought his way to avoid accepting any responsibility was simply to flood with information and to really confuse. And he did his best, and to some extent got away with it.
Nicola, I'm sure you have some thoughts about Wormald.
Wormald by name, Wormald by nature. He was terrible. I have to say, the cross-examination of him by Brenda Campbell-Casey on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice was an absolute masterclass. She set out exactly what was known on the date that advice was sent to care homes to do nothing. She set out that there were 13 positive cases in the UK, which doesn't sound that much, but bearing in mind there had been fewer than 7,000 tests. Deaths in Italy had doubled overnight, and we had 700 people on the Diamond Princess who were infected. And she made the point very well that cruise ship is almost like a care home in terms of the conditions that people were living in, that you are all going to visit the same places, that people will be going from room to room, such as, in this case, it might be cleaners. In the care home, it might be the carers. On any assessment, that was human-to-human transmission in the UK. And our advice to care homes was do nothing. Human-to-human transmission is unlikely. And he stood by that advice and said it was correct. And that, for me, was possibly the angriest I have been throughout this entire inquiry. It was so disgusting that he stands by that. And I feel so sad for people who had to listen to that, who know what their loved ones went through in care homes. And for him to stand by that evidence was truly disgraceful.
I agree. I lost my husband in care, and I know a large number of our members lost their loved ones in care, and that is just awful to hear. Nicola, while you're there, can I ask you, I'm a little confused. I've been hearing about Nimbus. Can you tell me a bit about what that is?
So I would love to tell you more, but there's a whole lot of secrecy surrounding this. So it was a tabletop exercise that was conducted on the 12th of February So when we knew that the pandemic had happened internationally, hadn't quite hit us as hard as it was going to, but we knew we had to get ready for it. And so this was a tabletop exercise where our government departments were supposed to figure out what they needed to do to respond if the reasonable worst case scenario came about. What we know from the evidence of Sir Simon Stevens was that there was a discussion about, if we get to this point where NHS is overwhelmed and resources are stretched, who makes the decision about how care is prioritised and how those overstretched resources are allocated? And Matt Hancock put his hand up and said he should be the one to make those decisions about who gets care, who gets the ventilator, who lives or dies. That was stunning. That we've all seen what Matt Hancock is like, but to actually have it confirmed that he has this God complex is frightening. Thankfully, Exercise Nimbus didn't lead to that conclusion, but there is, we understand, a report of the outcomes of that exercise, and nobody has it. Apparently, nobody's seen it. The final witness yesterday from Public Health England, Yvonne Doyle, she said she doesn't have it. She's sure somebody has it, but the inquiry still don't have it. So we've got Matt Hancock wanting to play God, thinks he's the best person to decide who gets to live or die, and nobody's seen this report. Why not?
Thank you, Nicola. Thanks everyone for coming and participating in the podcast on what has been a really, really difficult week. I wonder if I could just come to you for last thoughts about the week. Amos?
Yeah, I mean, as we said, it was an incredibly traumatic week, really, listening to how it's my grandma, when she went into a care home for 3 weeks for a trial period, caught COVID and was dead weeks later, to have her death essentially described as meaningless, her as dispensable, was just horrific. And so, hopefully there's certainly going to be a lot for the interim report, but as we said, the dynamics are going to be difficult for her to come to conclusions, and I'm certainly really hopeful that there'll be recommendations that are digestible and that they can implement easily. But I was still struck by the gaps in the evidence this week. Helen McNamara's phone and all sorts of things that are missing. We've still got Boris Johnson's missing WhatsApp, Sunak, and the spectre of Sunak is still looming large over this. And it will be interesting to see how that pans out in the future, because obviously you have the Eat Out to Help Out decisions and his failures to financially back things, and he's still very, again, like Boris Johnson, very boosterish. I was brilliant, I did all these things, but he was drag kicking and street screaming to everything, wasn't he? I remember, it was furlough, but it was furlough reluctantly. So we'll see what happens in the future, but want to look out for, I think. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Nathan, your last thought?
I think it'd be very easy to focus on all the negative and the horrific stuff we've heard this week, but I think there is something that is relatively important to acknowledge about this week. All these things have come out because a group of people who were bereaved and in suffering came together to campaign for an inquiry. And actually, it's very easy to focus on the hurt and the devastation that's been heard this week. These things needed to come out into the public domain. And actually, without that campaign and people like Nicola Brook, Canter and various others helping, we wouldn't have reached this point. And actually, I think there's a moment of having to reflect and acknowledge those things, because there'll be more to come out. And again, it's down to things. And on a more light bit, the thing I found most statistically interesting this week, Lee Kane, Director of communications expert, used the phrase, 242 times during his witness appearance. So there's hopefully more light out one. But the serious point, it wouldn't have got here without people coming together and being organised and campaigning. I think that needs to be acknowledged and marked in the sand at moments like this.
And thank you for reminding us of that, Nathan. I think that's really important. Anthony, Can we have your thoughts?
I'm actually going to adopt something that Nathan's just said, because I'd like to feel that, and our clients, of course, patient advocacy groups, completely bewildered what had happened, no assistance from the government or any department or anything at all, how they got themselves together to be such powerful, effective advocates was truly phenomenal. And I'd like to think increasingly, as the evidence emerges in terms of the level of marginalization and the state of knowledge, increasing knowledge, but awareness right from the early time. Of course, there was evidence, a bit of positive evidence that came, I think, from Cummings, could have been Kane, in relation, I think it was Kane, right back at the early part of 2020, even before the pandemic, about the awareness of long-term sequelae, that increasingly, thankfully, the centrality of the significance, not just of the horrific stuff that horrific things that happens to the bereaved and their families, but also that the increasingly, I'd like to believe, evidentially, the long COVID groups are going to have some influence in terms of the decision that and the reports that will be made in terms of hopefully dealing with expectations in the future for those who don't thankfully die, but who suffer long-term and ongoing long-term harm. So I absolutely endorse what Nathan's saying as far as my clients, because I think overall my thoughts about the week were it was devastating, shocking, in many ways appalling, the level of chaos as self-defined, but also very revelatory. And I would like to think of a very, very significant week when it comes to ultimately the findings that will need to be made. And thank you very much for inviting me onto the programme.
Thank you, Anthony. I'll leave the last word with our Nicola.
2 final thoughts from me. One, whenever Anthony has asked questions about the failure to warn people about the risk of long COVID, the answer has always been, well, we've told people not to get COVID, full stop. That's enough. That fundamentally misses the point that young people who were healthy were told, if you get it, you might feel a bit bad for a week, but you'll get over it and you'll be fine. Warning people that actually long COVID is just as much of a risk. We don't know why you might get it, and actually it might devastate you for the rest of your life. That's a completely different message that people needed to hear, to tell, so that they kept their kids safe. So that's my first thought. My second thought is, after everything that's come out this week, I hope the people who question the need for this inquiry have their answer. Everyone who says, why are we spending all this money? Don't we know everything that happened? Isn't it time to move on? No. This is your answer this week.
Co-sign. That is absolutely right, Nicola. Thank you all so much for joining us. And Nicola, see you next week.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.